Mom stalker, suburban house, night knocks, motion light, white sedan, hidden Bluetooth tracker, UV powder on deadbolt. I found who watched my mom.
The first time I understood that fear can be a sound, it was a small, deliberate tap on our front window at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a branch. It was the kind of soft knuckle a person uses when they've already decided you will answer. The knock didn't wake me because I was already awake. I was a month into sleeping on the couch at my mom's place, pretending I was there to save on rent, and not because my phone had begun collecting messages from her at odd hours that started cheerful and ended brittle. She had stopped saying she was fine and started saying she didn't want to make a big deal. That is how you translate fear when you do not want to give it furniture in your house. My mom isn't dramatic. She treats worry like a chore you do in the garage so you don't track it through the living room. She is the person who labels holiday lights before she boxes them and puts the sharp knives in a separate drawer so guests don't find them first. If she says something is off, you don't shrug it into coincidence. You get specific. Specifics had appeared one by one, then all at once. The side gate we kept chained had begun to be found unhooked in the mornings. The motion light over the driveway clipped on around 2 or 3 at least twice a week, even though the camera never caught cats or kids. My mom's potted herbs moved an inch to the left and then an inch back, as if someone was checking to see whether she would notice. A folded index card had been tucked under the windshield wiper with a heart drawn on it, which looks like kindness until you remember that a heart is also shaped like an opening. She laughed that one off the way you laugh when you are telling yourself not to name patterns too early. Then came the wintergreen smell. My mom does not chew mints. She puts out plain toothpicks for guests after dinner like it's 1979. But near the back door, under the deadbolt, the air sometimes kept a memory of wintergreen. It lived there for a few minutes and then left, the way a person leaves a room and the room does not want to admit it. She started locking the deadbolt 3 times on instinct and then started taking pictures of the lock after she checked it so she could show herself in the morning that she wasn't losing it. A week before I moved onto the couch, the smoke detector chirped at 3 a.m. and then died, as if someone had leaned on the test button and thought better of it. The battery wasn't loose, the ladder wasn't out, the chirp had the confidence of a finger. When she told me that part, my body performed the decision for me. I packed a bag, told my landlord I would be scarce, and started being present like a guard dog who pays rent. The first few nights were uneventful in the way relief is boring. We watched game shows with the volume low. I replaced the screws in the strike plate with longer ones like the internet says, and installed cheap cameras that upload to a cloud until the cloud decides to cost money, and set an old phone to act as a monitor near the back door. I stacked plating weights against the slider because sometimes you need the illusion of medieval solutions. I felt like a child playing at security and hoped the cosplay would be enough. It wasn't. A pattern emerged with the petty patience stalkers admire in themselves. The cameras never showed a face. A motion clip would capture the motion light waking up, then darkness. The cloud would log an outage between 1:58 and 2:07 with a note about connectivity issues, as if the house itself had decided to blink. We would wake to the hum of the fridge and the certainty that a person had been on the other side of the wall while we were counting the same sheep. Mom's work bag, always left by the door, would be an inch out of line with the grout. The bathroom mirror would carry a faint oval, the kind you leave with breath and a gloved hand.
Police did not make sense until you had a face or a threat you could quote. We had neither. We had smells and inches and power blips and a stack of receipts for home improvement. The officer who finally came out walked the perimeter with the casual stride of someone who has been to this address and the address 3 streets over and the address downtown where nothing is staged. He admired my screws, recorded our report, and suggested dusk to dawn bulbs. He used the phrase likely animal while standing under a motion light mounted at 6 feet and looking at a chain that had been moved by fingers that knew how to keep their fingernails to themselves. That night, my mom went to bed early with the podcast turned up too loud and the bedside lamp on like a sun. I took the couch and the remote and the job of watching the front window for the world to decide what it wanted from us. Around 2, the power in the living room clicked off for a breath and came back. The camera at the back door did the digital version of a shrug. A minute later, a slow tap reached the glass. We both froze in separate rooms, our bodies turning into listening devices. The next sound was a foot on the front step pretending to be a cat. The step is concrete. Cats don't weigh enough to sound like that. I didn't go to the door. I sat and tried to name what was happening, because names are handles, and panic hates being picked up. Whoever it was waited, then retreated, then returned to the back door and tested the deadbolt with the softness of someone who didn't want to leave visible intent. The wintergreen smell arrived like a signature. If you have never smelled wintergreen in a locked house at 2 a.m, I hope you never learn whether it makes your teeth ache. I made tea at 2:30 because tea is the story you tell yourself when you want to pretend you are already okay. Mom came out in slippers, eyes wide, but not white, and we stood in the kitchen pretending that steam is protection. She told me she had recognized the smell from the first time weeks earlier. She had smelled it once at work near a maintenance closet, and again after a parent-teacher conference. She left early because a man in the lot had stared too long at the list of student pickup times. She didn't want to connect the dots because connecting dots makes pictures, and pictures are harder to deny. I started cataloging everything, dates and times of motion lights, the chirp pattern from the smoke detector, the moments her phone lost service for a minute in the grocery store and then came back with a set of notifications it should have delivered earlier. The days my car and her car both amassed a thin layer of dust except for a fingertip swipe near the handles. I took photos of shoe prints in the garden bed and matched them to nobody. I ordered a battery camera we could move around, and the day it arrived, the porch showed an empty frame where the package had been for 12 minutes and then wasn't. The shipper swore it had been delivered. I believe them. I also believe the porch. Friends offered advice that ranged from motion sensors to big dogs to simply moving. We did the first two. The third felt like a win for a person we refused to promote to antagonist. People online called what we were living hypervigilance and advised routines. I built routines as if I had been hired. Lights on timers, trash bins chained together, lock checks with photos. Every night ended with me at the kitchen table with a notebook and my mom standing behind me trying to learn the shape of my confidence.
The second time the window knock came, something new joined it. A folded flyer slid under the front mat. In the morning, the paper advertised a lost dog with a photo that did not look like a dog we had ever seen in our neighborhood, and a QR code that led to a blank site. The phone number used an area code from 2 counties away that, when entered, pinged nothing. The flyer had been placed after 1 a.m. because I had checked the porch at 12:45. The edges were damp in a way rain does not arrange. Whoever had delivered it knew we would be the ones to find it. Whoever had delivered it wanted us to practice looking at paper so it would be normal when paper started talking. Mom admitted she had changed routes home twice in the last month because a white sedan kept appearing in different mirrors, as if the highway was a loop. She said the driver stayed back 2 cars always and never passed, which is how you follow someone if you took a class from a person who learned their surveillance vocabulary from cop shows. She said the sedan had once parked across from the house for 15 minutes with its lights off, the way a person pretends to be a neighbor. She hadn't written down the plate because plates are for when you believe strangers can save you quickly. I started to believe that the person wasn't new to us. The smallness of the gestures felt like familiarity, not curiosity. Strangers leave bigger footprints. Friends leave fingerprints on the exact objects that mean something to you. The herb pots had moved, not the grill. The lock had been tested, not the window. The smoke detector's chirp had been interrupted, not the circuit breaker. Whoever he was wanted us to practice being watched, not practice fighting. That thought should have helped. It didn't. It meant the circle was smaller than the city and larger than the house. It meant I had to start with who knew my mom's schedule without Facebook, who had been in this kitchen and knew where the mugs live, who had seen the chain on the gate and the cheap cameras and the weights against the slider. A list like that starts with family and ends with anyone who has ever loved you badly. I wrote down names I hated writing, then scratched them out because superstition feels like safety when evidence is asleep. I included my dad, even though he lives 3 states away and cannot show up at 2 a.m. without logistics. I included neighbors, an ex-coworker who used to invent reasons to stop by with leftovers, a contractor who had key access for a week during a kitchen repair, and the man from my mom's book club who complimented tools as if the compliment were a pretext for inventory. I included her boyfriend because grown men who show up always deserve to be on lists, even when they fix things you ask them to fix, and bring you grapes because you mentioned once that grapes make you feel fancy. The next morning, the batteries in the back door camera were on the table with a note card that said "low" in my mom's handwriting, which would have been fine except the camera had been powered and the note card had not been written by anyone in the house. She stared at her own loops and said she didn't remember writing them. I believed her because the card smelled like wintergreen and my mom smells like coffee and laundry. A person had taken the time to mimic her hand. A person had taken the time to place a joke in the shape of a favor. I stopped waiting for the house to tell me what was wrong and started treating it like a person who needed a blood panel. I tore that place apart in a way that made me apologize in my head while I did it. I found nothing until I crawled under the kitchen sink and reached behind the P-trap for a flashlight we keep for outages. The flashlight was there. So was a neat strip of duct tape holding a coin-sized disc against the inner wall, the kind of tiny tracker you buy to stop losing luggage and start losing illusions. The phone in my pocket made a noise it doesn't usually make and told me an unknown device was traveling with me that did not belong to me. I turned the notification off and took the tracker out with 2 fingers as if it were a tick.
Part of me wanted the answer right then, to plug the serial into a database and print a face. Part of me wanted to pretend I had not touched it, to leave it in place and follow it back to itself. The part that won was the part that knows panic makes you dumb. I slipped it into a foil-wrapped tea tin, put the tin on the porch, and watched the camera that never saw faces forget to admit the moment. If I had to summarize the next 72 hours, I would call them the days I learned my mom was being watched by someone who assumed we would keep acting like we didn't know. I learned that assumption is a safer place to live than a house. I didn't sleep. I made a plan. I started with the map. The notebook that had looked like superstition a week before became a grid on the kitchen table. Dates, times, smells, knocks, outages, the exact minutes the motion light tossed a circle on the driveway, the way the smoke detector skipped and then behaved, the arrival of the dog flyer, the lost package, the white sedan reports. I printed my mom's work shifts and overlaid them with the incidents. I added my own comings and goings because stalkers sometimes perform for the secondary audience. When you chart ordinary days with the intensity of a person writing a thriller, routine admits its weight. A pattern stepped forward without permission. The motion lights and the knocks clustered on nights when my mom's boyfriend said he was working the graveyard switch at his warehouse. I did not want that sentence to be true before I tested it. I called the warehouse and reached a generic line that confirmed only that nights existed. I drove past the facility at 2:30 a.m. on one of his supposed shifts. The lot held 3 cars and 1 semi. His truck was not among them. That proved nothing. People commute. People borrow. People park where you aren't looking. I asked my mom for permission to go through her phone and calendar like an auditor. She laughed without mirth and handed me both, which is its own kind of trust. Her calendar showed a set of recurring entries for a book club that met twice a month and a physician follow-up next Tuesday, and a reminder to send a birthday card to a cousin who always sends hers late. I scrolled through messages with the men in her life. My dad sent memes with dogs and sunglasses and exactly 2 sentences at a time, always at reasonable hours because he is a person who translates love into daylight. Her boyfriend's messages were a parade of check-ins that read, caring at first glance. He asked if she had made it home, if she needed anything from the store, if the outside light worked, if the lock had been acting up, if she had noticed anyone on the street lately, if she wanted him to swing by just in case.
A person who wants to be reliable uses those sentences. A person who wants to build a schedule uses them too. I opened her email for receipts. 2 months earlier, she had forwarded him a photo of our back door to ask whether the weather stripping looked worn. The photo had been taken from an angle that revealed the exact lock brand and the screws I'd bragged about. A week later, he had brought a bag with supplies and installed a new strip while telling stories about his boss and a pallet jack. He left with the bag and a magnetized key that I had not noticed missing from the little dish near the microwave. My mom keeps a spare there because an old neighbor used to check on our cat when we went away. The neighbor moved, the dish stayed. The spare key in my pocket was the one on my ring. Hers was on hers. The dish should have contained the third. It did not. I walked the yard early and found a single print near the gate where the soil takes impressions. A straight-lined work boot with a notch missing from the heel. I compared them to my boots, and to my mother's garden shoes, and to the neighbor's shoe ghosts in the flower bed. None matched. Later that day, her boyfriend arrived with groceries and stood on the step while my mom put milk in the fridge. His boots carried the same notch. I told myself half the boots in the county look like that. I told myself coincidence has a right to exist. I opened the screen wider and kept my face like the weather. The tracker under the sink throbbed in my thoughts like a low battery. I took it to a friend who builds race drones in his garage and asked him to open it. He likes puzzles, not people, which made him exactly the sort you recruit. He cracked the casing with a screwdriver and showed me a tiny board and a watch cell. He said it looked like a cheap BLE tracker, the kind that pairs to a phone through an app that screams about lost keys. He read the ID off a component and said we could try to see if any nearby devices broadcast a relationship. We drove the block with his laptop listening and found dozens of devices because everyone carries a broadcast in their pocket. The tracker quieted when I moved it away from the house and screamed when I brought it close, which told me nothing except that the person who owned the app had been near us recently and liked to be near us again. I tried the car. Under the bumper, taped like a secret, a second coin waited. My phone offered that same unfamiliar alert like a neighbor clearing his throat. I didn't remove it. I drove across town and parked behind a grocery where teens launched shopping carts toward each other for sport. The alert followed me and then stopped in a different lot at a different time. I circled back and watched from a distance as a dark truck eased into the space where I had been and idled. The driver stayed put. I could not see his face. I could see the wintergreen tin in his cup holder when the dashboard glowed. Mint is not a crime. Neither was attention to detail. I counted 5 minutes and then left without teaching him that I had learned a new alphabet. My aunt called that night to ask how Mom was doing, because my aunt has a meter for my mom's voice that rivals my own. I told her we were adjusting and then asked, casually, whether she had run into Mom's ex-coworker lately, the one who used to stop by with leftovers. My aunt said he had moved to Florida to care for a parent. I asked about the contractor who had renovated the kitchen. She said he was on a new build 15 miles away and had a foreman who loves to complain on Facebook. I asked about the man from book club who likes to comment on everyone's tools. She laughed and said he had taken up pickleball to avoid reading. I asked about Dad even though I didn't need to. He said he was sending photos of a new dog. None of it felt like a face. All of it eliminated faces I wanted to suspect. Sometimes, answers sit in the dumbest places. I had been ignoring the old laptop on the hall table because my mom mostly uses her phone. The laptop had a calendar app that synced with people she shared with. I scrolled through her shares and found exactly one, a calendar that her boyfriend had created labeled Home. It included trash days, his paydays, and a repeating entry titled Yard. The Yard entry occurred on nights that matched our motion light notes by a margin that did not feel like luck. I stared until the dates blurred. I did not want to believe that a man who held my mother's grocery list like a promise would schedule his ghost visits with the same platform he used to remember when to mow the yard. I needed something that wouldn't fit inside denial. Maps and calendars can be argued with. Smells and notches can be explained. I went to a hardware shop and bought a tiny bottle of UV powder, like the one an old detective had once used in a video to prove that people touch doorknobs more than they think. That night, while Mom was brushing her teeth, I dusted the spare key dish and the back door deadbolt. The powder is invisible in daylight and shouts under a black light. I placed the UV flashlight on the table and went to bed with the careful purpose of a person laying a net. At 1:50 a.m., the power blinked again. The camera lost 2 minutes. The motion light flared, then died as if embarrassed. I lay still and counted to 200. When the count ran out, I walked to the kitchen and turned on the blacklight. The spare key dish glowed like a confession. The deadbolt handle sang. My hands did not. My mother's did not. I sat in a chair without making a sound and let the room become a courtroom. Morning arrived with the bright stupidity of a world that assumes your night was uneventful. At 9:10 a.m., my mom's boyfriend let himself in while calling my mom's name from the hallway and apologizing for not texting. I watched his knuckles skim the spare key dish the way you skim a countertop in a kitchen that is not yours. When he reached for a mug, the back of his hand glowed faintly under the blacklight I kept on my lap out of sight. He noticed the tea tin on the porch and brought it inside with a joke about neighbors and porch pirates. The wintergreen ribbon in the air when he closed the door made me understand how superstition dies.
I did not confront him. I learned things in that moment that mattered more than victory. I learned he wanted credit for safety without the responsibility of being safe. I learned he liked my mother's gratitude more than her rest. I learned he believed that leaving small signs would make us depend on him as translator. I learned that if I showed rage early, he would perform being wounded, and the world loves wounded men even when women are the ones counting bolts. So I did the most boring thing I could think of. I made a folder. I printed the calendar entries. I saved the tracker ID. I kept the tea tin closed with tape. I took a photo of the UV glow on the dish and dated it. I pulled the SIM from the porch camera and dumped the motion clips to a thumb drive. I found an old repair invoice in a drawer that included his surname and a middle initial he claims he does not use. I typed his name into court record searches for counties he had mentioned. 3 cases with protective orders surfaced from years ago, filed by women whose names I did not recognize and who did not owe me their trauma. The orders were old but not dead. One had a note about violating boundaries around workplaces. Another included a line about surveillance tactics that read like my last month. I sat with that folder until the sun crossed the kitchen floor and fell off the table. I felt sadness first, then anger, then a clean line of purpose. I called the domestic violence hotline not because I fit their target caller, but because I trusted their instincts more than I trusted mine. The advocate on the line listened to my description of smells and inches and cameras that look away. She asked whether we were safe that hour, whether we had somewhere else to stay, whether my mom trusted me to move first. She suggested a safety plan and a protective order and a way to preserve evidence that would outlast a panic attack. She used the word pattern the way a surgeon uses the word tumor. Careful, not afraid. When I hung up, I stopped using the phrase maybe. The next part would require my mother. It would require her to put a line through a story she had been enjoying about new companionship after years of loneliness. It would require her to admit that someone who brought milk and grapes also brought fear in gift wrap. It would require me to speak without quoting and to make a case without the satisfaction of a punchline. I do not know if you have ever sat across from your mother at a kitchen table and explained a pattern that rearranges her life. It is not a talent I hoped to develop. I delayed the conversation by 1 day and used that day to set one more trap. I posted a fake plan to the shared home calendar, a note that my mom would be at a church rummage sale across town from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The church exists. The sale did not. I told no one else and waited. At 6:12 p.m., the motion light on our porch clicked on and stayed on for a count of 60. The back door camera timestamped a shadow where a person chooses to be a shadow. A minute later, a white sedan rolled slowly past the house and did not stop.
My phone, which I had left paired to the car tracker, lit up with the same alert as before and then went quiet as the signal moved away. At 6:40 p.m., in the far lot of the real church with no sail, a dark truck idled with its lights off. The driver wore a cap. He did not get out. He waited exactly long enough to verify that my mother's car did not arrive, then left. I did not chase him. I opened the folder again and added one more page. I went home and knocked on my mother's bedroom door with my knuckles so gently that even I trusted me.
I started with the powder because fluorescent truth offends denial. The dish glowed. The deadbolt glowed. I explained how I had dusted them and why they lit. I explained how the tracker under the sink had celebrated my presence until I put it in a tin and sent it to the porch to starve. I explained the second tracker under the bumper that had followed us until another car took our place and performed waiting. I said the word pattern and felt her flinch, the way you flinch after the first cut when you are bracing for the second. She asked how I knew it was him without using his name. I told her I would use names only after I showed her a map. She nodded like a person choosing surgery. I laid the calendar over our notes and let dates do the arithmetic. The home calendar's yard entries aligned with the motion lights and the knocks in a way randomness could not explain without developing a sense of humor. The tracker alert screenshots matched the nights he said he was on shift. The warehouse lot photos I had taken at 2:30 in the morning showed 3 cars and 1 semi, and no familiar truck. The court record printouts carried his middle initial, and the same city where he had claimed to live 10 years earlier on a form for a gun range membership. The white sedan sidings fit around his truck sidings like weather fronts. The boots matched a heel I did not know how to dismiss. The wintergreen mints belonged to him so loudly that my mom's pantry had developed a phantom scent. She sat with all of that and held it the way you hold a box you are about to take to the curb. She is not a woman who crumbles. She is a woman who rearranges. She began rearranging out loud. She acknowledged that the lost dog flyer had not been a neighborhood service. It had been a test of whether we read paper slipped under a mat. She acknowledged the index card under the wiper with the heart had been a lure with a child's craft project for camouflage. She acknowledged the nights her phone had lost service in the grocery store were the same nights her boyfriend had been conveniently in the area and had offered to meet her in the parking lot so she didn't have to walk alone. She remembered the time he had arrived with the weather stripping and asked where we keep the spare key so he could move the car out of the garage while he worked. She remembered giving it to him without thinking because hands were already busy and because trust is heavy to carry and sometimes you let someone else hold it for a minute. What she felt after the rearrangement had a shape I recognized from my own life when I learned a person was not who they had sold themselves to be. The shape mixes violation with embarrassment and sprinkles in a dash of performance critique, as if your body wants to workshop the play so it can run better next time. She apologized to me for not seeing it earlier. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, because predators rely on apologetic targets. She smiled without joy and told me she would accept my point as a loan until her body believed it. She asked what we do next. I had consulted the hotline for exactly that moment. We called the non-emergency number for the department that assigns officers to protective orders and asked for guidance. The dispatcher transferred us to a desk where a sergeant explained the process in simple, non-theatrical sentences. We would come to the station with what we had. We would file. They would advise us on how to serve the order and how to ask a judge for a temporary one while the paperwork became formal. We would change locks with a professional who would document the work, not because locks cannot be picked, but because paper is how you teach systems to behave. We would tell neighbors in boring language so they did not turn this into sport. Before we drove, my mom asked for 10 minutes alone. She is entitled to private grief. I used those minutes to grab the folder, the thumb drive, the SIM, the trackers, the powder bottle, and every screenshot my laptop had collected. I added a list of names with only one name circled. I added the dog flyer and the index card with the heart, and the UV flashlight that would prove I had not invented chemistry.
At the station, the desk officer ushered us into a small office that smelled of coffee and paper. He listened to my timeline and my mother's rerun of her days. He did not roll his eyes at smells and inches. He asked practical questions about access and schedule and whether we had friends we trusted to stay with us that night. He used the phrase pattern without prompting. He asked for the folder and gave me a receipt, because evidence is a relationship, not a Dropbox. He said a judge could review a temporary order that afternoon and that a longer hearing would require us to stand in front of a room and say the quiet parts with our mouths. My mother said she could do that. Her voice did not tremble. I have never loved her more.
The temporary order went through before dinner. A process server would bring it to him. He would be notified that he was not to contact, not to approach, not to enter, not to possess duplicate keys, not to use third parties, not to hover in a truck on the far end of a church lot, waiting for people who do not exist. If he violated, he would be arrested. We drove home with the radio off and watched the street for trucks and sedans. Every truck looked like his until it didn't. Every sedan looked like a different problem. We pulled into the driveway and sat there until our breathing matched the tick of the cooling engine. We did not speak, because victory is loud, and this did not feel like victory. It felt like the start of a job. The locksmith arrived within an hour, with a rolling toolbox and a cheerful efficiency that told me he has delivered a new life to a lot of doors. He swapped the deadbolt for a model he called boring, in a tone that meant effective. He drilled a small hole in the frame for a sensor that would tell our phones if the door opened while we were away. He recommended a hinge pin alarm for the slider that screams when someone lifts the door. He took photos for his invoice and told us we were not difficult customers. He did not ask for details. He has a meter for grief that keeps his hands moving. We told 2 neighbors, one on each side, that a man had been showing up when he was not invited. We said his name and watched their faces learn it. We asked them to call us, not him, if they saw his truck or the white sedan. We asked them not to post about it in the neighborhood group. We gave them copies of the temporary order in case they needed a story to tell themselves about why they were allowed to interfere with a man who would call himself a friend. At 9 that night, the process server left a message that service had been completed. I imagined the envelope in his hand and the flash of indignation men perform when paper interrupts their myth. I imagined the wintergreen tin rolling to the footwell while he reached for proof that the world had wronged him. I changed the Wi-Fi password and reset the camera logins with a string of nonsense that would insult a person who thinks he is clever. I unshared the home calendar and created a private one for my mom and me. I set an alert on my phone that would announce any unknown tracker traveling with us and configured it to scream when it detected one instead of whisper. Then I did the most honest thing I could think to do. I asked my mom to text him a message informing him that she had served a protective order and would only communicate through the court. She wrote it without adjectives. She read it to me without looking up. She hit send. We turned our phones face down and let the house learn a new silence. The first response was immediate, 6 calls from a number that had never been stored. The second response was delayed rage, a long block of text taking credit for the cameras and the lights and the sense of safety we had grown addicted to. The third response was a picture of our front porch taken from the sidewalk with a timestamp from last month, and a caption that attempted to cast himself as the hero of a story only he understood. We took screenshots and did not reply. At midnight, a truck idled 2 houses down for 5 minutes. The motion light clicked on and held. The truck left. The night felt like a test we had passed by not moving. I went to bed and slept for 2 hours, which felt like a holiday. Morning brought an email from an address with his middle initial in it, asking to meet to clear up a misunderstanding. He suggested a diner, he suggested a parking lot, he suggested we were overreacting and that gratitude had curdled into paranoia. I forwarded the note to the officer on our case with a polite request for record keeping. He replied with thanks and a reminder that violations of the order should be reported in real time.
I am not a vigilante. I am also not a person who can resist building a trap that isn't illegal. I replied to the email with a single sentence directing him to send any statements in writing to my mother's attorney. The attorney does not exist, but the sentence made him imagine one, which is sometimes enough. He responded with a new version of himself that was careful and seething at once. I added the message to the folder and bought us both breakfast, like nourishment is armor. The day after, the officer called to say the hearing for a longer order would be in a week. He recommended we gather any footage from neighbors and any records from the tracker notifications. He recommended we bring the flyers, the index card, the calendar prints, the UV photos, the work boot photo from the yard, and the court records from the other county. He said a judge appreciates a story that does not ask them to imagine. He said we had done well. He said to expect charm in the courtroom and to let the folder talk louder than charm. I took a walk that afternoon past the maintenance closet at my mom's workplace because I wanted to know whether Wintergreen lived there too. It did, faintly, the way institutions collect smells over years. He had installed a memory for us using the cheapest cologne a drugstore sells. He had turned a scent into a brand and then sprayed it around our lives. I stood there and understood fully that he had been writing a script called Rescuer. He had given himself both parts, the villain who taps windows and the man who points to scratches and assures you he can fix them if you let him more inside. He was born for times when gratitude looks like a key in a dish. The hearing would be where we take the script back. Courtrooms are designed to make drama behave. The wood absorbs anger. The clock insists on everyone taking turns. The microphones forgive shaky voices. We sat at a table with our folder while a bailiff explained rules in the same tone he probably uses to describe how to find the bathrooms. On the other side, the man who had been in our kitchen performed the role of concerned boyfriend whose kindness had been misinterpreted. He wore a jacket he had not ironed and a face that practiced contrition in the mirror. He avoided looking at me and aimed his sympathy toward my mother like an IV. The judge asked for the story. We did not deliver speeches. We delivered paper. Dates and times, photos of the glowing powder and the glowing hands, the dog flyer that led nowhere, the index card from the windshield, the calendar entries he had named Yard, the tracker ID and the phone alerts, the screenshots of emails and late-night calls, the court record copies from the other county with protective orders that looked too much like ours to be coincidence. Neighbors submitted short statements about a truck idling and a white sedan cruising and a man walking past our porch too often to be exercise. He made a face trained to communicate hurt. He called himself overprotective and said he had stopped by to check lights because the neighborhood was changing and the news had made him careful. He said the calendar entries were reminders to mow. He said the powder could have been from a mechanic's shop. He said the trackers were ghosts. He said he had never entered without permission and that any handprints were from fixing the deadbolt after we had invited him. He said he had no idea why his name appeared in other cases and that those women had misunderstood him or wanted money. He suggested we were ungrateful. He suggested my mother had given mixed signals. He suggested I resented him for being helpful. The judge did not entertain suggestions without receipts. He asked simple questions. Why did the home calendar include trash collection for a house you do not own? Why did the trackers activate at times that correspond to late-night knocks? Why does your shoe print include a notch in the heel that appears in a photo of prints behind their gate? Why did your truck idle on a street near their home after a protective order had been served? Why did you send emails after being instructed to communicate through the court? Why does your name appear on an order 3 counties over that mentions surveillance? Why is there wintergreen on your seat? The man's answers were the kind of answers people give when they learn too late that charm is not a legal defense. He said things about concern and about complicated relationships and about how hard it is to be a man who cares when people are afraid. He spoke as if the room owed him a better soundtrack. The judge granted a year-long order with the possibility of extension.
He restricted proximity and contact and included the truck and the white sedan by plate. He advised the man to remove himself from any digital access, including shared calendars and device pairings. He advised us to call immediately if violations occurred. He used the phrase stalking behavior without raising his voice, which made the phrase heavier than any shout. When it was over, the man left with the quick step of someone who wants to outrun a story. We drove home and sat again in the driveway and let our breathing slow on purpose. The house looked exactly the same. The kitchen cabinets still squeaked, the plant on the sill still leaned toward the light. The only new furniture in the room was time that did not ask to be managed. The days after did not become a movie. They became chores. I canceled a streaming service he had logged into. I replaced the garage keypad. We moved the spare key dish into a drawer we don't use and left the dish itself where it had always been, empty as a dare. The tracker alerts went silent. The motion light still flared at moths and raccoons like a drama queen. The cameras kept recording birds that believe they are celebrities. My mom slept a little, then a little more. She stopped performing calm and started practicing it. People asked how we were, and we said the boring truth. We were tired. We were fine. We were lucky. We were less trusting and more thorough. We kept the folder in a waterproof bag. We kept the UV flashlight by the door, not because we would need it again, but because tools deserve retirement parties. We kept the new habit of telling neighbors when we would be gone and when we would be back. We kept the practice of making tea at 2 in the morning on the rare nights a sound woke us, not because tea shields you, but because ritual is a bridge between adrenaline and decisions. What I learned about stalkers is not that they lurk in bushes in trench coats. What I learned is that some of them wear work boots with a notch missing, carry groceries as camouflage, and schedule their own crimes on the same calendar where they remind themselves to take out the trash. They present as solution while auditioning for problem. They build dependence before they build locks. They are thrilled by a house that thanks them. They are irritated by a house that documents them. They are caught by paper more often than by punches. I learned something else about my mother. She is not fragile for trusting. She is not foolish for liking mowed lawns and groceries and a man who asks whether her porch light flickers. She is a person who deserves those things without the surveillance that was braided into them. She let herself be loved badly for a season because loneliness makes you barter. And then she let herself be loved correctly by her own boundaries. That is not a weakness correcting itself, that is a strength remembering its name. When people ask the clickbait version, who was the stalker, I give the answer in a sentence that is true and not a spoiler. He was the man who most often volunteered to keep her safe. He kept turning safety into a job only he could do. He did not expect the house to hire someone else. He did not expect the house to hire me. We saved the folder. We saved each other's sleep. We saved the spare key dish as a joke we can afford to make now. We saved the wintergreen smell in our memory only as a warning, not as a soundtrack. We kept the lock with the longer screws and the sensor that tells our phones when the door opens. We kept tea in the cabinet and chairs at the table, and the habit of listing specifics when our bodies notice a knock. I thought the story might end when the judge's signature dried. It didn't. It ends in small places, night after night, when the motion light flares for a moth and my mom does not tense. It ends when she parks at the grocery without scanning every third car. It ends when I stop counting screws and start counting recipes again. It ends when the house believes us. If you want the line people share, it's this. I found out who my mom's stalker actually is. He was the man who had given himself the job of hero. He wrote a script where we needed him to interpret noises and teach us which shadows to fear. We tore the pages out. We kept the light, and we learned that the most dangerous knock sometimes is the one you hear inside your own body long before anyone touches the glass.